Three, two, one.
Hi everyone, this is Dr. Liz, and you're listening to Include with Dr. Liz. This show is about everyone, all people, including you. It's about people and their diverse lived experience in this world. I chat with guests to get to know them, their identities, and their inclusion needs, so we all have an opportunity to understand how best to include them, so together we can create a world where everyone thrives. We're not exploring the Colorado mountains on the weekend. Dr. Sarah is a mayonnaise despising mum of four who is described as funny, thoughtful, and sometimes misunderstood, and even sometimes stubborn. Dr. Sarah works with educational organisations and leaders to embrace change in order to create more effective and joyful learning environments. And she loves what she does. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks. So happy to be here.
I'm really looking forward to today's conversation because I am passionate about learning. So I'm super keen to look at how your identities and intersections just flow into your work and how you build that into your work as well.
Well, I'm happy to have this conversation with you.
Now, in your questionnaire, you share with in the what's random and fabulous about you. I know that's not how I phrase it. I think it's like, what would someone be surprised to know about you? And you said you've been legally dead twice.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you share that with us?
Yeah. So the first time I was 2 and I had meningitis, and this was before the meningitis vaccine came out. And when I entered the hospital, there were 6 other kids who had meningitis. And by the time I left, 5 of them had died and one of them was comatose. And during my hospital stay, my heart stopped for 7 minutes and they declared me dead. And I came back. I don't remember it because I was 2. And the second time I was 5 and on vacation with my family in the Bahamas and I drowned. I was actually underwater, they think, for 12 minutes. And I came up and my heart was stopped. And again, they declared me dead. And I woke up, and that one I was a little bit older. So I remember waking up and looking at my hands and they were blue. But I'm here. My mom used to say that it's because I had a purpose that I hadn't fulfilled. So
I'm glad you're here.
on what that purpose is and when it is fulfilled.
I want to know, do you have a fear of water or anything? Like, has there been
I don't have a fear of water. I have a fear of water going up my nose. So I won't ever jump into a pool or a lake or something without like holding my face.
Right. That makes sense to me. I mean, funny that you say that though. Whenever I watch someone, particularly if you're jumping from somewhat of a height, I always worry for them when they're blocking their nose, because if anyone's watching the momentum because I have done a bit of on holidays where you jump from a significant height into water when I was a teen, and I remember watching one girl do it where she pinched her nose, and as she's gone in the force of landing, threw her hand up through the skin of her eyes and just ripped off all of her skin. So I warn you, don't jump from heights while blocking your nose.
I will keep that in mind. That sounds terrible.
I have to tell you that it's probably the closest I've been afraid of being underwater, because you go so deep. And because I still remember when you're jumping off at that height, you kind of instinctively hold your breath at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then you realize, oh my gosh, I haven't gone into the water yet. And so you kind of go, like, and then you go so deep, and then you're like desperate to get to the top again because you don't have enough breath. Okay, there's a flashback I didn't know I had in my memory banks. Okay. All right. So I want to go, how old were you when to Jerusalem? Like, how old were you then?
I was there for my master's program. So I was there like in my mid-20s for 3 years.
Mm-hmm. And was what you were studying in relevant to going to Israel for it, or was it that it was for something else?
Yeah, so I have a master's in Jewish education, and so it made sense for me to do that in Jerusalem. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. So I want to ask a question then around, you go from Colorado Springs or from Denver and the Jewish religion being a minority, and how you describe yourself, seeing like you're not the right word, but you know how you hear people say, I'm not black enough, or I'm not gay enough, or I'm not something enough, or I'm not doing it right. Of course, there is no right. Like, we'd be very clear to anyone's listening, there is no right. So I wonder, how was it different? Did you Oh, I know. I'm really curious on the experience for you.
Well, every situation's been different. So I went from Colorado Springs to St. Louis. And like I said, I had this very weird experience because I felt very Jewish, but all the Jewish people knew all these terms that I didn't because they'd all been part of a youth group. And I didn't know what NCSY and BBYO and NIFTY were, and they all went to these camps. And so their form of being Jewish wasn't mine. And so I didn't fit in. So I wasn't involved at all in Jewish life in college, even though it was a very Jewish college,
Wow.
because I didn't fit in.
Mm.
And then I worked in the Jewish community for a little bit in St. Louis, and I went straight from that to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, it's also interesting because Jerusalem has really like two main forms of being Jewish. One is to be traditionally observant, and there's a whole bunch of communities and places for that. And one is to be completely secular and to feel like Judaism is part of your culture, but not a religion.
Got it.
And there's very little space for people in between. And I, like I said, I was in my mid-20s. I was very much in this place of trying to explore. And, I'm not being told how to be Jewish by my parents. What does this mean for me? And it was just an interesting scenario to be navigating because in theory, being Jewish was the majority there. And yet it was much easier to be specific kinds of being Jewish. And I wasn't sure what that was. I moved to the Washington, D.C. area, which also was very Jewish. I came back to, the part that I lived in was pretty Jewish, not the majority, but and now I'm in Denver. And so in each of these scenarios, it's been really interesting. And like I said, I have found the most comfort and acceptance when I'm not surrounded by lots of other Jews, because then I don't have external pressure of how I'm supposed to be or how I'm supposed to celebrate or how I'm supposed to observe. It's also been, I have 4 kids. So it's also been really interesting for me to navigate them in their different environments and what being Jewish means to them and us as a family because they spent 1 year at a public school, for example, where they were very possibly the only Jews. And the public school was very accepting. They had 23 different languages. Their Winterfest was not about Christmas. They were very accepting of all sorts of different cultures. And other schools where they've been at, where in theory they would have been the majority, sometimes they don't fit in the same way. So we've had I'm 41, so I've gone on a 41-year career of what does it mean to be Jewish and navigating that as part of my identity, both internally and how that means I relate to other people. And my oldest is 13, so now I'm going on 13 years of navigating that with my kids as a family.
How do you know when you're not psychologically safe? The reason I like to ask this question, particularly in the context of what we're talking about now, is that those that need to make us feel psychologically safe aren't other women, obviously. And so those that are listening that aren't women, this advice is for you. But if we say we need you to create psychological safety, it's such a cerebral concept, right? And I always think, are we really helping ourselves by saying we need more psychological safety? So how do you know you feel psychologically safe in a team? Any advice?
I mean, I think it's a feeling of being allowed, permitted, welcomed, encouraged to show up as yourself. And whatever that means, and recognizing that people have good days and bad days and people have different opinions and things like that, but that you're not supposed to be anything, that you will be welcomed and appreciated for yourself.
So if I am, and you work with educational institutions, so if I am a man working in an educational institution, or just a man working in business, how can I demonstrate that to you? What are some practical things for me that I should be doing or holding myself to account for, to making sure you feel like you can bring your whole self, be your authentic self, and contribute?
Well, some of it's interesting because it's so many things that we don't notice. Like I didn't even notice it until I suddenly had this wake up call. But there's so many times where I was in a meeting and it would be me and 6 men. And even if all the men are doing their very best to provide psychological safety and to treat me as an equal, it would be hard for me to feel like I can show up as myself. It would be hard for me to feel like I can voice my opinion, especially if it went against anything that was being said. So just like looking at the entire landscape with that kind of critical eye of, we can absolutely assume best intent. So absolutely, if there's 6 men and 1 woman in a meeting, I'm not saying that you're obviously terrible and you're discriminating against women and this, that, and the other. And so we just assume best intent. You're doing the best that you can. It just so happened that this is. And how might that make the one woman in the room feel?
Mm.
You know, would there be other women that could be invited? Do we actually need all 6 men and 1 woman? Like, could it be 2 men and 1 woman, which is still lopsided, but not as intimidating? If it is that kind of meeting, is there a space? You know, there's a lot of research out there about how brainstorming is actually not good anyway. And what you should be doing is individual thinking and then sharing. So especially in that kind of environment, how are you providing opportunities for everyone to show up as themselves, which actually benefits everyone? Because you never know, you know, there might be somebody in the male group that doesn't feel safe. You know, being very cognizant of language. I'm sure that a bunch of these comments that were made to me were made in jest. You know, there was one person I know that he was a friend of mine, and I'm sure he thought he was joking with me. And for a while, maybe I thought he was joking with me. And then it started to bother me.
Yeah.
And so just to be overly conscious of that kind of comment, even if the person is laughing, or even if somebody says it's okay, it's not okay. And it shouldn't be on the other person to voice that it's not okay.
Absolutely. And so if I was to say, so here's how I'd summarize at a practical standpoint. If I am one of those 6 men in that room with that one female, probably some of the things I might consider doing, absolute, like you said, consciousness of look around, be observant, know what's going on in the room, help establish credibility and the role that people are there to contribute. So provide an opportunity. You don't have to just call it out on the woman. You know, you're here because everyone should present at the beginning of the meeting. This is why I'm here. This is what I'm going to be contributing today, or why it's relevant I'm here. Establish credibility. And then if you observe at any point someone speaking over the female, someone taking credit for what the female said, someone not giving space to the female to speak, do all of the above. Correct it and make sure you create that space so that that can happen.
And it's good for everyone. You know,
Of
in
course.
education, I believe I've been doing a lot of work with students with learning challenges. And the things that are good for students with learning challenges in a classroom are good for everyone.
Correct.
So the kinds of things that you're mentioning are good for everyone. You know,
Yeah.
establishing a purpose of a meeting and having every single person clearly identify what his or her role is and what they're there for will lead to a more effective and efficient meeting. It's not just for the benefit of the woman that's there. And so these kinds of practices will elevate your entire organization and have the side effect of being more inclusive.
100%. So we're completely on the same page, because when I talk about creating inclusive meetings in this context, how we facilitate to ensure everyone has a voice, everyone has space, everyone is respected. It works in this example of gender imbalance. It works in racial, ethnic, cultural imbalance, people with English as a second language. It works at people that are neurodiverse and think differently and observe differently. It works for people that have vision and hearing needs. It might it assists every identity. So this is why I keep saying inclusion isn't about the label or the specific identity. It's about including everyone's needs so that they can thrive.
Which helps the organization, because if your people are thriving, then you're thriving.
Yes, we are certainly on the same page. So you started to talk about then the relevance of not directly the term inclusion, but including people so that they can learn better, so that they can thrive. I'm really curious to sort of discuss how you approach that in your work.
You know, in my work, I'm really big on process. And that was actually something that I wasn't so into early in my career. I was very focused on the product, and it didn't matter how we got there. And over the last decade, and especially in my current work, I've recognized the value of the process as being just as, if not maybe more important than the product and how you get there. And so I talk a lot about taking a step back, articulating our goals. What are we trying to accomplish? I talk a lot about making sure the right stakeholders are involved. Yes, some will only have a voice while others may have a vote and others may have a veto, but the stakeholders need to be involved and there needs to be a buy-in. And when you think really big picture about the process, and when you leave space for the stakeholders and space for iteration, then you have space for including those who should be included, the different stakeholders, the people who might be impacted. It gives, if you're open to iteration, because I find that a lot of people sometimes go about a process, but don't really have, like, they're doing it just for show. So they say they could do it, but they have an end in mind. Nobody feels included in that kind of process. So
Yeah.
if you go about a process legitimately open to what might be, it's totally fine for you to have a direction or a goal in mind, but being open to the process, I think that that's how I include it in my work, is by
Yeah.
just being very process oriented. And part of that process, like I said, is to make sure the right people are at the table, make sure that we're including people, make sure that we're maintaining. One of the things that's been most important to me over my career is clear and transparent communication all the time. Because that leads to more people feeling included. And if you're not communicating with people properly, it again, assume best intent, you probably don't mean anything by it. And the person who's not being communicated with feels excluded.
Mm.
So that's another piece that I really focus on as part of the process, is making sure that there's clear and transparent communication between everybody who's involved, to the outside community, to anyone who might be interested. And I think that leads to this sense of including everyone.
I love that. And the way that you're describing it, this is absolutely relevant in transformation of educational institutions. It's exactly the same approach that I take in corporate enterprise transformation. And then when I specialize down into inclusion transformation, where I give some specific advice around, so just to take exactly as you've said, when you're going through the way of, so here's some tips for listeners, that when you're doing the clear and transparent communications, consider who your end audience is and make sure that the language you're using is appropriate, whether it's simplified language or jargon language, whether they're translations, transcriptions, whether that people can consume it, that, reading isn't their preferred, is a visual representation better. Think about all of those needs in your communications. And then when you're going through your consultation, so the voice bit that Sarah shared in the voice, I loved it. I was memorizing it the whole time. Voice, vote, veto. I'm so stealing that from you. I usually use it in a term of a RACI. If anyone knows about the RACI framework, I usually use that. But I like the simplified version of the alliteration, is that it is, of the V's. But with consultation, it's about thinking not just about the diverse stakeholders as their roles, but in terms of the diversity of the people that are in those roles. So make sure you are putting effort into, and I use the 8 inclusion needs of all people to do that. I don't apply labels to it. I just seek through the organization or the community or the stakeholders to make sure inclusion needs are met right across those 8 needs, which means you get a more comprehensive input. So your product, as you mentioned it, the output or whatever the end goal is or objective, you're more likely not to have to redo it because you've had everyone engaged, more people are bought in, there's less pushback on the change, and you've inclusively innovated most likely throughout that process to ensure that you don't have to fix it because it didn't work for someone. There we go. We just did a change management and inclusion transformation lesson. I might, when I edit this, realize that we've used a whole heap of jargon, which I tell people not to do. So apologies if we did, because clearly when you get into, I didn't realize this was happening. You get into a room of someone that does what you do for a living in terms of transformation, you start using language like anyway. Something that you said earlier around raising 4 boys. And it's interesting that you're saying that raising them to explore their own identity as being Jewish. Is it what you expected? Are they all the same? Are they different because
It's interesting. And it's also, it relates to my philosophy of education also. So I'm one of 3. My mom used to say that she didn't know that you could have more than 2 opposites until she had 3 kids. And I have 4 kids and they're so different. And I think about that all the time in terms of our school system, because I have 4 kids who share DNA. They all grow up in the same house. They have the same access to the same resources, and yet they're so different in their dispositions and their demeanor and their skills and what they need from an educational institution. So I connect that in my work as an educator of, if my 4 kids don't all have the same needs, so how can we possibly expect a classroom of 22 to all be the same? But that's a different story. In terms of my kids and navigating their Judaism, it's really fascinating because, like I said, they are all different. So I have a 13-year-old boy, an 11-year-old girl, a 10-year-old boy, and an 8-year-old girl. and they all approach religion from a different perspective, both because they're different ages and because they're different kids. So my 13-year-old, for example, he had his bar mitzvah in June. So technically, like, he is obligated, he's responsible for his own Judaism, he's responsible for making his own choices. He's also someone who never just does something to do something. He's very interested in knowing why and what's important and why do I do this and what's meaningful. He's in 8th grade, so he's very impacted by, he goes to a Jewish day school. He's very impacted by what his peers are doing and how they're celebrating their Judaism and manifesting their Judaism and how that's different to him. Whereas my 8-year-old is just excited about everything, and she loves everything, and she loves her teacher at school, and anything her teacher at school will say, she agrees, but she grapples with, she's like kept up at night about moral and ethical questions in the world. Like, she'll go to sleep at night and tell me that she can't sleep because she's worried about the homeless dogs. And so she's really concerned about these kinds of things. And so she really grapples in Judaism with some of the questions about, like, the relationship between Jews and non-Jews. So, for example, my brother, who is Jewish, is in a relationship with a non-Jewish woman, which in traditional Judaism is not acceptable. So and my brother drives to our house on Shabbat, which is not acceptable in traditional Judaism. So she likes to have these questions about what that means and are they really Jewish and that kind of thing. And it's been very interesting to explain to them at different levels, in different ways, as they're developmentally ready, different ways of being Jewish and where they have choice and where they don't have choice and where they'll eventually have choice. But as long as they're living in my house, they don't have choice, and walking them through that. And that's an approach I haven't been in a classroom teaching for quite some time, but when I used to teach, that was my approach. I used to teach a class, for example, on who wrote the Bible, who wrote the Torah. And some people believe that God wrote the Bible, and some people believe that humans wrote it. And I believe, as my role as an educator, it's not my job to tell the students what to believe. It's my job as an educator to present the students with information and facilitate their coming to some sort of conclusion. And I remember at the end of the semester, one of my students getting so frustrated with me because she was like, "Dr. Levy, we still don't know what you believe." And I was like, that is the point. What I believe is not important. And it's a little bit different being a parent, because I do think that, like, it comes into play a little bit different, but not the same. You know, my job as an educator and a parent is to raise my kids to be thoughtful, inquisitive humans who can make their own choices. And so it's been a journey. I got divorced about 3 years ago, and their dad approaches Judaism than I do. So we've also been navigating that. So not only do they have the 4 of them that are different, not only do they have their peers, but what Judaism looks like in my house is different than what Judaism looks like in their dad's house. And we do our very best to co-parent. So I don't want it to make it seem like my way of Judaism is better, you should hate your father and things like that. And so it's been very interesting for them to understand that even within their nuclear family, there's different Judaism.
Which brings the question to me, just listening to the story around, particularly, I'm envisaging your daughter. My daughter was exactly the same. She would read a book about something, and if a dog died, she'd be sobbing for days, right? Highly empathetic and concerned around the world, about the world around her. So I just really dived into that feeling, and I wondered how much your children have been impacted, and their peers, of the events since October 7th. There's been a lot in the news. There's been a lot around the protests, particularly I know on university campuses. Has there been any impacts to them?
Yeah, it's been really hard for them. And obviously they're different ages, so it impacts them different ways. They have my ex-husband's family is in Israel. And so they have cousins and uncles who fought. So it impacts them very, very deeply. My 13-year-old follows the news. And so he'll ask me about these 21 soldiers who were killed, or did you hear about this? Or did you hear about this? And my daughter, who cares deeply about dogs and homeless people and things like that, I remember on October 9th, the Monday after the war broke out, we were sitting and having breakfast before my kids went to school. And the school had sent out an email saying, "We're planning to discuss some of the events of October 7th with the students. Please make sure they have some sort of, like, they know about it before they come to school." So at breakfast, I shared with them a little bit about what was going on. And my 8-year-old her response, which broke my heart, was, I don't understand, why would people want to kill people just because they're Jewish?
Mm.
And it's just, I mean, I'm 41 and I can't answer that question. So it's very challenging to try to explain that kind of question to an 8-year-old. And I believe it's a deeply nuanced situation. And it's a nuanced situation that's hard for adults to understand the different sides and the different factors that come into play. And so it's been very challenging to navigate it with each of my kids. Like my 11-year-old only kind of cares, so she'll listen in on conversations, but it seems to be my 8-year-old and my 13-year-old are the most interesting, and I can't have the same conversations with them. Like my 13-year-old wants to know the facts, he wants to know this, he wants to know that. My 8-year-old wants to know why. The 13-year-old's questions are much easier to answer. It's been really interesting for them to navigate the impact that the events in Israel have had on the anti-Semitic climate in the United States. And they've seen a significant increase in security at their school. Fortunately, they haven't been impacted by anything. We live in Denver. The situation in Denver isn't the situation on college campuses and other places. So they've been bubbled a little bit, but it's definitely on their minds. And I think about that and they think about that. And it's a challenging situation for all of us to navigate, because it is my oldest was actually born in Israel. Like being Jewish and a connection to Israel is so deeply ingrained in our identity. And it's hard when there's people out that you feel like there's people out there who want you to not be alive just because of your identity.
Something that you said around how the school was really proactive in communicating quickly with parents to say, right, we are going to address the elephant in the room on Monday. Please make sure that you've given them some baseline of understanding. There is a very clear example of the benefit of sending your children to a Jewish school. And it's really interesting. It's like that catch-22, like you were saying, when you were in more Jewish environments, you felt less like you belonged. And here we have an example of really illustrating how people are seeing and being made to be seen and to belong. So interesting contradiction.
Well, it's actually been really interesting. In general, I find the Jewish community to be relatively divisive. People are I read this book called Jew versus Jew, and it talks about how Jews are sometimes the Jews' biggest enemy. And it's true, because the different types of being Jewish, they will fight with each other, they will argue with each other, they will hate each other, all sorts of different things. And since October 7th, there's been kind of a uniting of the Jewish community, for better or for worse. It's almost like an us versus them. And it's really interesting for me because on a daily basis, 98% of my world is the Jewish community. My kids go to a Jewish day school. I work out at the Jewish Community Center. All of my clients currently are Jewish organizations and Jewish schools. And so for the last couple of months, I have been in this little bubble where everyone I know is impacted and knows about the situation in Israel. And yeah, there's a spectrum about how everybody feels. But for the most part, everybody's very supportive of Israel and very empathetic to everything that's going on. And every meeting, for all of October and November, if I still had meetings, they started with, we just want to acknowledge, we want to share, meetings were canceled and put in place wellness and things like that. And so it was, given my mental state and what I needed, it was actually really reassuring that I had that space. And I did feel connected to the Jews around me, because it was this very uniting force.
Yeah. And I mean, you highlight the privilege that you had to be surrounded by people like that. Not everyone has that opportunity. They're
Yeah,
out.
I mean, a friend of mine called me. I hadn't spoken to him in months. And he called me and he's like, I feel really alone. I have no one to talk to. Like, his wife is not Jewish. His mother's not Jewish. He wasn't working in the Jewish community. He's like, everyone around me thinks that I'm crazy for these feelings that I have. I just need somebody to talk to. And it highlighted for me how different my experience was versus his, because it is that space of privilege. And it just happened to be, this thing happened and my world provided this nice cushion.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you had the cushion. I'm not glad you had to need it. I don't even know if I grammatically said that correctly, but I'm sure you understood my intent. So I can say, how did you get into consulting in Jewish schools? Seems like a redundant question, because we've talked about the connection between religion and the religious schools. But why the consulting and the transformation of schools for you?
Well, so I never intended to go into education. My undergrad's actually in business. and I worked for Neiman Marcus for a brief stint after I left college because I thought that's what I wanted to do. And there was no soul in it for me. And so I was desperately trying to find some sort of purpose. And I was like, 20 and trying to find my way and things like that. And I started working in Jewish education until I figured out what to do next. And then 5 years later, I was still working in it. And I thought, oh my gosh, like this could be what I do. And so I went on to get my master's. I taught. I love teaching and I don't love teaching. I love teaching because I love the interaction with the students and I'm a big picture thinker. And so I didn't like being confined to just my classroom and making an impact on just my students. I wanted to like rethink how we do the school. So I went into school administration. I ended up founding and running a school because I'm a progressive educator who's deeply committed to doing what's best for students and student-centered education, and just having that kind of impact. And running the school was both the hardest and most rewarding thing I've ever done in my entire life. It wasn't allowing me to live the life that I wanted in terms of being a mother and caring for myself and things like that, but I still wanted to be able to have an impact. And I took about 3 months off and tried to just figure out I've been dead twice. I clearly have a purpose on this planet. What is
What
my
is
purpose?
it?
How can I have this thing? My doctorate is in education. So I thought about just going into education and not staying with the Jewish education field, but my heart kept calling me back to Jewish education. And I had this feeling that there's a lot of great people out there trying to do great things and just struggling with it. Whether it's being ahead of school is really hard. You think it's one thing and then there's a gas leak or a chicken is eaten by a hawk or this or that or whatnot. And again, going into this place of assuming best intentions, like I think almost all, if not everyone who goes into school administration does so with the best intent. And then it's just hard. And so I figured that maybe the way that I could make an impact was to find the people trying to do the really cool things and help them and support them. And so whether it's my experience or my approach or my bandwidth or whatever. And so I found my little niche in empowering excellence in education, usually through helping an organization or a school navigate some sort of change. So I've leaned in heavily over the last year with artificial intelligence in education, for example, helping schools develop policy and consider what ethical and responsible usage is. I've done a lot in terms of just like up-leveling the program and trying to do what's best for students and really just, like I said, empowering the people that are really in the trenches trying to do the things.
Yeah. I mean, I was a high school teacher for 1 year. I used it as while I wait to do my next degree. I only did do it for 1 year, but almost for a similar reason for you is because once I taught 1 year, I had rewritten all of the delivery of of all 4 subjects that I taught. I rewrote all of it. And
Yeah.
then it came to the following term and I went, well, what else is there left to do? Like I can't make things better. Like that's already done. And so fortunately I started my master's in education, but mine was in organizational learning and development. So I then moved from originally management marketing, teaching for a year, and then back out into organizational capabilities. So it's also, I love hearing that you said that you founded a school because I too at one point went, I just know how to fix this. I know how to make this better for every student in this room. I just want, I have a whole theory about the perfect school that I would create still. But I am not
We
deluded.
founded a school and it happened to coincide with the pandemic.
Oh,
So that was fun.
good timing.
Good timing.
No, not good timing.
Oh, it was
No,
terrible.
terrible timing. No wonder. No wonder you had to take
Because starting and running a school is not hard enough. We have to throw in a pandemic.
Oh, goodness gracious. I'm going to put all of your contact details in the podcast description so people can get in contact with you. Are there any other secret ways you're bringing your magic to the world?
I gave a TEDx talk in September.
Did you? What was it about?
I did. It was about artificial intelligence as a catalyst for change in education.
Okay, give me the punchline.
Well, it's just that education is outdated. And if we don't do something, then it's going to be totally irrelevant because AI can do all the things we're teaching better and faster.
I mean, as a university professor, I'm always like, now that ChatGPT exists, you can actually remove plagiarism yourself through ChatGPT. How isn't Turnitin is never going to be able to catch up. We're never going to know if students have actually learned what they need to learn.
Well, that's why when I work with schools, I talk to them about don't fight it, embrace it. Like,
Mm.
what is a ChatGPT proof assessment that we can give? What are we actually trying to prove that our students know? And
Yeah.
if we're just trying to teach them things that ChatGPT can do, then we're teaching them the wrong things.
Oh, I love that. I think we need to catch up for coffee just because I love talking about just because I love talking about learning and the best way to do it. I and the worst part about being a teacher or a professor is marking essays. So let's just work out a better way to assess applied learning, please.
Yes, I'm in.
Thank you for your time today, Dr. Sarah. It was fabulous chatting to you.
Thank you. This was so fun.